Hello friends, today I'm going to show you how to apply double fold bias binding to an armhole opening, or really any opening, but I'm using an armhole as an example. And I do all of this right at my sewing machine. I don't get up and go back and forth to the iron. And you're going to start with your garment right side up, and you're going to unfold your bias tape. The inside is going to be the wrong side. The outside is the part with the folds in it, is the right side. So we're going to put the right side of our bias to the right side of the garment, matching up the raw edges. And I like to start right in the side seam, and you want to leave yourself a bit of a seam allowance, about 1/2 inch. And you're going to sew right in this crease that is provided, and I just do this right off the roll, and I sort of place it as I go, matching the raw edges together and turning my garment as I go. I don't pin it in place all at once. I don't really find that to be efficient or necessary. As you can see, I am just placing it as I go and turning my garment as I go. Stitching right in that crease. If you're using bias tape you purchased from the store, the creases will be there for you, and those are going to help you keep your seam allowance straight. And you're just going to go all the way around till you meet till you meet back at the side seam where you started. And be sure to fold that seam allowance we left at the beginning out of the way. And my goal is to end my needle point right at the same point that I began, but not going over that folded seam allowance. And you're going to backstitch. You might need a hand crank just for accuracy here. And then clip your threads. And you're going to cut this excess. You can see how I started and ended at just about the same point. You're going to cut this excess again, leave yourself some seam allowance. And now I'm going to fold my top wrong sides together at the side seam and get this bias edge available to me so I can sew it without catching my top underneath. And you're just going to do a 1/2 inch seam allowance again, and I can see on there where I ended my last stitch, so I'm going to go just past that so I don't catch my top underneath. Those raw edges are matched up, and I'm just going to stitch across that short edge of the bias tape. Clipping my threads, and then you're going to open this back up and just sort of finger press it flat where you just sewed. And now you're going to press again. I just use my fingers. I do all of this in one sitting. Press the bias tape upwards towards the opening of the armhole, and we're going to catch all of that seam allowance, the seam allowance of the bias tape and the armhole, in our stitch here. And what I'm doing is edge stitching about 1/8 of an inch away from my seam on the right side of the bias tape. I'm not stitching on my shirt. I'm stitching on the bias tape, and just barely right past that seam. This is called understitching. This is going to make sure that everything, once we turn it to the inside, is going to have a nice clean turn, and you won't see any bias tape poking out from the right side of the garment. And as I go, I'm sort of pulling the bias tape away from the garment so I can get good access to that 1/8 of an inch, my seam line. Clipping my threads here. And now we're going to flip to the inside of the garment. You can see my understitching there. All looks very nice. Now I'm going to flip to the inside of my garment. You're going to be looking at the wrong side of your garment. And we're going to fold. You're going to fold once at that first fold. Fold again at the middle fold. And you could just stitch down here if you wanted a cute little accent trim, but this is where we want this to be hidden. So we're going to fold it one more time. Make sure everything's nice and flat. And getting that bias tape all turned towards the inside. So one fold, two fold, the third fold. It's funny that they call this double fold bias tapes because there's really 4 folds in the bias tape. And then I'm going to start edge stitching again, catching that bias tape. And at this point you should be about 1/4 of an inch away from your clean finished edge. And when you use, this is bias tape that I made. When you use store-bought bias tape, it really is so easy. Those creases are in there for you. You can see exactly where everything is supposed to fold. You might need to trim out some of the seam allowance from your garment to get a cleaner fold and less bulk. I didn't do that here obviously, but that is an option for you. And as you can see, I made this bias tape, but there are already creases in it, so it's just doing exactly what I need it to do as I'm going around. At the end, you really want to make sure, again, bias tape is called bias tape because it's cut on the bias grain, so it does have some stretch. So you want to make sure there's no creases or wrinkles. You want to be sure to be pulling it as it goes around that final curve. That's why tape is cut on the bias, so that it has the give to be able to make it around the curves without puckering. And that is how I clean finish an armhole with bias tape. You can do this obviously on a neckline as well, or any circular opening. I always start at more subtle start points, usually at a side seam or a shoulder seam. And this is what it looks like when it is done. And of course you want to give it a nice press. Get a lot of those creases out. This is a muslin that I'm showing you on, so it's not really the nicest fabric to be doing this with, but you want to give it a nice press, make sure everything's nice and smooth, and then you will have a nice clean finished armhole or neckline. Your bias tape will not show in the front, and you will be good to go. Here we go. My nice clean finished armhole, no bias tape showing. I'm going to press that again, get some of those wrinkles out. And it's a very professional, easy finish for woven garments. If you have a tailor's hand, that will help you get a lot of these creases out on the curve. Again, if you're using nicer fabric, you won't have as many creases as I have here. And that is our clean finished armhole. I like to use contrast bias just because it's fun. You could also make your own bias tape out of the same fabric so it matches. And that's it. Happy sewing, everyone!